Now we need to learn about how we produce energy from the food we eat and which food choices might be best based upon your activity level. Well, bioenergetics is the process of converting the compounds of the foods we eat, like carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, into a usable form of energy. Bioenergetics then relates directly to your metabolism. And metabolism is the sum of all the energy transformations that occur in your body. This could be anything from activating certain proteins or helping your immune system to function properly. These processes all require energy. Most people think that energy is, in this context, is something that you might get from coffee or from an energy drink. That is not what I'm talking about here, but we will talk about that later in the course. We produce actual energy by converting the food we eat into something called adenosine triphosphate, better known as ATP. And ATP is often called the energy currency of the body because in a sense we pay for all of our biological actions with ATP. To release the energy from ATP, it is broken apart into smaller components in a process called hydrolysis, using an enzyme called ATPase. ATP is broken into these smaller components to produce an adenosine diphosphate, a single phosphate molecule, and energy. So food is eaten, eventually converted into ATP, carbon dioxide, and water. And when ATP is used to produce work for all of your metabolic needs and daily activities. And heat is also produced in the process of making energy. Essentially, you simply have changed the chemical composition of the food you eat into other forms of usable energy and heat. This follows what is known to you as the first law of thermodynamics, which states that energy is neither created nor destroyed, but only changed in form. So ATP is stored chemical energy that links the energy producing and energy requiring functions within all of our cells. This energy fuels all forms of biological work. Just think about processes that utilize ATP like digestion and absorption, nerve transmission, blood circulating through your body, and muscular contractions. One question you may have is, how do we make and replace our stores of ATP? Well, we have three energy systems to do this for us. In all three systems, a phosphate group is added to adenosine diphosphate, or ADP, in a process called phosphorylation to ultimately create adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. And what this means is that phosphate is added to ADP and then it's stored as ATP until the energy in ATP is needed for activities like walking up the stairs, picking up a box, or exercising. The really interesting part is that each energy system has a specific role and works at the highest rate based upon how hard or how intense you are working. Each system has a different way of providing ATP, but it is important to realize that they are used on a continuum and they do overlap quite a bit. In addition, certain parts of each of the three energy systems can also work to provide ATP in the other two energy systems. So while this may sound confusing and problematic, it is actually a really cool way for you to get all of the ATP out of whatever it is that you are doing and whatever fuel source, carbs, fats, or proteins, that you are using to provide the energy. And by understanding these three energy systems, what you will gain is the ability to decide what to eat or what certain nutrients may be best to support whatever it is you are actually doing. Think about it like this. If you are doing something that uses more carbohydrates to produce ATP, then you will know what to eat to optimize not only your performance, but also your body composition. But on the other hand, if you are doing something in your daily routine that burns more fat for ATP or energy production, then there is less need to eat carbohydrates at that time. And this allows you to better understand what you should eat to optimize energy production, limit storing excess fat, and improve success for fat loss. Now, I'll describe these energy systems in terms of how carbohydrates, fats, and proteins are used to make ATP. But in reality, we don't go to the grocery store and buy carbs, proteins, and fats individually. We buy and eat food, and foods are typically a combination of the three macronutrients. So while this may be some of the nitty-gritty details of how you make energy, we will follow this lecture up with plenty of information that might be more readily applicable to your body composition goals. Sounds good, right? Well, let's get into it. The three energy-producing systems are the creatine phosphate system, the glycolytic system, and the oxidative system. All of these systems work to provide us energy, but one system typically is used more than the others during different exercise and rest scenarios. So, for the first energy system, the creatine phosphate system, this works hardest for us during maximal intensity exercise. Just think about running fast for a few seconds or lifting a heavy object or weight. That's the creatine phosphate system. In this system, you will create ATP first by combining a phosphate with stored creatine, which is a combination of amino acids, to form creatine phosphate. Then the enzyme creatine kinase breaks the phosphate off of creatine phosphate and allows it to combine with ADP. This forms more ATP and free creatine. This process is anaerobic. It occurs without oxygen. Now, of course, you are still breathing oxygen at the normal 21% that exists in the atmosphere, but these energy-creating processes are called anaerobic, meaning without oxygen, because ATP can be produced without the presence of oxygen in the cells. Think about when you run up a flight of stairs and you're out of breath. This would be a lack of oxygen in your cells, but the ability to get up the stairs despite the lack of oxygen is provided primarily by the creatine phosphate system. So the term anaerobic also tells us that this system is one that will work when you are doing intense activity or exercise. So the creatine phosphate energy system works quickly, but it does not last for long. About 30 seconds is all you'll get, depending on your fitness level, but it is the most rapid method to regenerate ATP. But don't think that just because the creatine phosphate system is so short-lived that it isn't valuable. It is extremely useful to us. Think about any time you need to do a very quick action, quickly jump out of the way of something, run quickly for a few steps, or lift something heavy. All of these require the creatine phosphate system. If you're really active, this system is also handy to give quick, hard efforts when you need to run up a hill, pass someone in a race, or lift heavy weights. Most exercise physiology textbooks will set a 30-second limit rule for this system. But the creatine phosphate system can be used at nearly any point of activity and repeated after a short break, even though the energy production only lasts for a few seconds. This is because of something called the size principle for muscle use, which says that you can recruit muscles for activity in an orderly and efficient fashion, from smallest to largest. So some muscles will burn through their stored creatine phosphate, but other larger muscle fibers will keep it until it is needed for a burst of high-intensity activity. Interestingly, creatine stores are useful for everyone, not just power and strength athletes. Also, although creatine is made naturally in our bodies, we do get some from the foods we eat, mostly from meat. So yes, vegetarians and vegans who primarily eat vegetables will likely have less stored creatine. But creatine can also be consumed as a supplement. In fact, it is the most widely studied sports nutrition supplement on the planet, and now research is showing the benefits of creatine supplement use for just about every population, young, old, healthy, and diseased. We'll discuss this and other supplements later in the course. The second energy system is the glycolytic system, which is also called anaerobic glycolysis. And this system relies on carbohydrates as a fuel source to make energy. The glycolytic system lasts longer than the creatine phosphate system, but probably not more than about 2 minutes while you're working hard. It is also called anaerobic glycolysis because once again you produce ATP without the need for oxygen in your cells. Think of an athlete running a 400-meter dash, or think of yourself doing short swimming intervals or treadmill exercise that you could only maintain for 1 to 2 minutes before needing a break. Glycolysis, as the name implies, is the breakdown of carbohydrates or glucose to make ATP. And glucose is in any type of carbohydrate that you would eat or drink. It could be a sports drink, it could be a piece of bread, or even an apple. But once the glucose is in your blood, you need to get it into your cells to break it down to either make ATP or to store it as glycogen for later use. You can use stored glycogen or the glucose from food that you've recently eaten to make ATP. In both cases, you first need to get the glucose into your cells. Okay, luckily, there's an elaborate system of proteins called GLUT transporters that assist with this. The glycolytic energy system is one you rely on during any sort of physical activity. Again, the three energy systems work on a continuum where they are all working but kick in to a much greater extent when required by the intensity for what you are doing, whether typing on your computer or lifting weights or running a marathon. So during glycolysis, your body breaks down glucose to eventually produce molecules called pyruvate as well as ATP. It's interesting to note that glycolysis both uses up and produces ATP. So along this pathway, the net amount of ATP produced is considered moderate at best. And don't forget, this energy system can only sustain activity for about 2 minutes. And the other end product of the glycolytic system, in addition to ATP, is pyruvate. Under conditions where oxygen is limited, like during hard exercise, pyruvate will go on to form lactate. And lactate, or lactic acid, is often considered to be a bad thing. You've probably heard of people saying that lactate causes pain in your legs when exercising, for example. Well, truth be told, lactate is the good guy, not the bad guy of metabolism. Lactate is actually a storage depot for the excess hydrogen ions produced as a byproduct of this glycolytic energy system working to make you ATP. You see, when you break down glucose to make some ATP, you also produce hydrogen ions. Well, if you're working out intensely, then the hydrogen ions will accumulate and build up, eventually causing a drop in your pH of the muscles. This drop in pH from the hydrogen ions is known as lactate acidosis and is painful. It is this acidity that makes you slow down or even stop for a breather during exercise. But here's why lactate is not bad. The lactic acid formed helps keep glycolysis functioning to make just a little more ATP or to give you energy to perform more work for just a little bit longer before you have to slow down or stop. One really neat thing about lactate is that it can also be transformed back into glucose for later use in this glycolytic energy system. The process of forming new glucose from non-carbohydrate sources, in this case from lactate, is called gluconeogenesis. And lactate leaves the muscle, it's converted back into pyruvate in the liver, and then reformed into glucose. This process is called the Cori cycle. And the newly formed glucose then makes its way back to the blood and then to the muscles to produce ATP in this glycolytic energy system. Think of it this way. Pretend you're doing hard exercise intervals like running uphill. Eventually, you will feel your legs begin to burn, which is just an indication that the energy is being produced and the acidity is increasing in your muscles. This, again, is caused by the hydrogen ions that are a product of glycolysis, and they ultimately combine with pyruvate to form lactic acid. Likely, the pain associated with the acidity increasing in your legs will make you slow down. Now, having slowed down, you're able to actually use that buildup lactate by transforming it back into glucose to provide more fuel to produce ATP in this energy system. Because you slowed down and allowed yourself to catch your breath, that is, allowed oxygen to be available to your metabolic processes, you begin again to transform pyruvate, the end product of glycolysis, into another molecule called acetyl coenzyme A, or acetyl-CoA, rather than forming lactate. It is this acetyl-CoA that can then move into the third energy system to provide even more ATP. Acetyl-CoA is actually called the common intermediate for energy production, because in order to make lots of ATP in the third energy system, you must first form acetyl-CoA, no matter if you are burning carbohydrates, fats, or proteins as your energy source. It is the common point for entry of all these fuels to make energy in the oxidative system. We've discussed the creatine phosphate system, the glycolytic system. So the third energy system is the oxidative system. This energy system relies upon carbohydrates, fats, and in some cases protein to provide ATP. The oxidative system is your long and slow system, which kicks in after about 90 seconds to 2 minutes of activity and can last almost indefinitely, as long as the intensity of activity is low to moderate. It's aerobic, unlike the other two energy systems, so it uses oxygen. As you know, with sufficient oxygen from slowing down to breathe a little during vigorous exercise, the pyruvate will get transferred into acetyl-CoA rather than forming lactate in the glycolytic energy system. It is through the aerobic transformation of acetyl-CoA that glucose and fat continue to be metabolized with this third energy system, aerobic glycolysis, or the oxidative system. Here, the acetyl-CoA will now enter what is called the Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle. In the Krebs cycle, and further down the metabolic pathway, you get to begin to produce much more ATP than was possible in the first two energy systems. This production of ATP is completed in the electron transport chain where oxygen is present. So because oxygen must be present, this means that the system works when you are working at a low to moderate level of activity, or simply sitting still. For example, if you are walking, you'll be using the aerobic system to produce energy. The way the electron transport chain works is by shuttling electrons down the electron transport chain to create a concentration gradient that ultimately works to produce ATP using an enzyme called ATP synthase. If glucose is being used in this third system to make ATP, you can make almost 40 molecules of ATP. Compare this to the 2 to 3 molecules of ATP made in the glycolytic system, and you can easily see that much more ATP is made with the aerobic oxidative system. Here's another really cool aspect of metabolism. When fat is used in the oxidative system, this is where you really make a lot of energy. Now, fat burning, or fat oxidation, requires more oxygen per ATP produced compared to energy production from glucose or glycogen. Meaning, once again, you need to be resting or working out at a slow to moderate intensity to utilize fat as a fuel. However, fat provides 12 times more ATP than glucose, just at a slower rate. So now, it is easy to see why fat is thought of as an almost endless source of energy. Fat provides lots of ATP, and we have lots of stored fat on our bodies, even if you are very lean. The oxidative system is active for most of your day, while sitting at a computer, walking around, or even when just watching TV. Again, carbohydrates and fats are the primary fuel sources used to provide ATP in the oxidative system. But this system can also metabolize some protein for energy production. This does not typically happen though, unless someone has been exercising for a very long time, say longer than 2 to 3 hours, or for someone who has not eaten in a long time. Keep in mind though, that you never only use fat or only use carbs. The reality is that the fuel used to provide ATP in these energy systems is typically a combination of fuels, and again, not an all or none sort of action. For example, while you're at rest and just sitting around, about 2/3 of the ATP you make is from fat, and 1/3 will be from carbohydrates. What is really interesting is that the more fit you are, the better you are at using fat as a fuel. Also, the more fit you are, the better you are at saving your stored glucose or glycogen until you really need it, like when you pick up the intensity of your exercise. This is just one more reason to consider adding physical activity into your daily lifestyle. It will impact the fuel you use all day long. You see, as you exercise and your training status increases, you can increase the number of mitochondria that you have in the cells of the muscles at work. This is called mitochondrial density, and you want it to be high. The mitochondria are the organelles within your cells that help you produce large amounts of ATP. So it makes sense, right? The more you exercise, the more you put exercise into your lifestyle, the better you are at making energy. Another benefit is that you can increase the number of capillaries, or small blood vessels you have to bring blood, oxygen, and other nutrients to working muscles. This is called capillary density, which you also want to be high. What's more is that with exercise training, you actually increase the activity of enzymes called lipases that increase fat breakdown. Exercise also increases the hormones that are used to help initiate this fat breakdown. So, by maintaining exercise as part of your life, you increase the ability to use fuels effectively by your body. And here's the key. You decrease your reliance upon carbohydrates and use more fat as a fuel, regardless of what you're doing all day long. This means that at rest and during exercise, you are burning a greater amount of fat. And over time, this will no doubt impact your body composition. The fat that is used to make ATP can come from stored fat tissue, like around your waists and hips, but it can also come from dietary fat that you've eaten. You even have fat stored in your muscles to use for energy. And this type of fat is called intramuscular triglycerides, or IMTG. Interestingly, you'll find intramuscular triglycerides in both very fit and also in out-of-shape people. But how these stored depots of fat are utilized is extremely different between the fit and the unfit. For the out-of-shape people, these intramuscular fat stores can actually do harm and alter proper cell signaling that should occur in response to various hormones. But in physically active people, the intramuscular fats tend to be used as an energy source, sparing glycogen and increasing fat use for activity. So while both fat and carbs will be used in the oxidative system, the amount of fat used compared to how much carbohydrate is used is highly dependent upon a number of key factors. These factors include things like, when did you last eat? When did you last exercise? How fit are you? And what hormones are circulating in your blood? All of these aspects of how fuel is used to alter body composition will be covered in this course. But for now, just know that the human body is absolutely amazing and adjusts to what you eat by burning more of that type of nutrient. For example, in a healthy person, you should be able to use more fat for fuel when you eat more fat, when you have not eaten for a long time, or during prolonged periods of exercise. This ability to shift easily from one fuel source to the other based upon the exact circumstance is called metabolic flexibility. Interestingly, researchers are now investigating people who are unable to switch easily between fuel sources, those who might be classified as metabolically inflexible. What we know now is that being sedentary, overweight, or obese is associated with less metabolic flexibility. Essentially, someone who is obese may have more trouble burning fat as a fuel than someone who is physically active and lean. One really cool part about metabolic flexibility is that in a lab setting, we can actually measure what fuel source, fat or carbohydrate, you are using. This is done by measuring the amounts of carbon dioxide and oxygen in your breath at rest or during exercise. The ratio of carbon dioxide produced to oxygen consumed is called the respiratory exchange ratio, or RER. When burning 100% fat for fuel, your RER is equal to 0.7. But when burning 100% carbohydrate for energy, your RER is 1.0. So, when walking slowly, you'll be using primarily fat to produce ATP because this is aerobic and would use the oxidative energy system. And as a result, your RER would be at or very close to 0.7. But as you increase the intensity of your walk to a jog or to a run and move into the glycolytic energy system, you'll use much more carbohydrate as the primary fuel source. Here, your RER would be at or near 1.0. Basically, the faster and harder you go, the greater percent of carbohydrate that will be used to make energy or ATP. But keep in mind that there will always be a mix of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins used to produce energy. The more metabolically flexible you are, the better you will be at using energy sources at the exact right moment. So now you can see that when you are doing low-intensity effort, walking, working while sedentary, or watching TV, you would not need a large amount of carbohydrates. It simply doesn't make sense metabolically. But when you decide to be physically active, exert yourself to strengthen your heart, lungs, and muscles, then you might be better off eating carbohydrates on those days. In this way, you can take advantage of your metabolism and use the inherent metabolic use of fuels that is called bioenergetics. In this way, you'll be less likely to store what you eat as excess body fat and improve your nutrient partitioning, particularly when food is not eaten in a huge serving size. So, the point of this lecture was not to overwhelm you with metabolic and biochemical pathways, but rather to demonstrate how the food we eat is broken down to provide energy for us in everything we do and enjoy doing. It should be clear now that your body composition could be changed quite a bit by just understanding the three energy systems and what the primary fuel source is for each one of them. To recap, if most of your day is spent in a sedentary way, sitting at a computer, in a car, or on a couch, then the reliance upon carbohydrate for energy is very small. So for this individual, it might make sense to consider cutting way back on overall carbohydrate intake. However, for someone who is quite active all day, standing and walking most of the day, actively engaged in exercise, and using intense exercise frequently, then it would make sense to eat a higher amount of carbohydrates. It might help to think of your fuel use and energy systems like a car with a series of gas tanks in it. This is an analogy that is often used in exercise physiology courses. Tank 1 would be very small, but would produce ATP quickly, although you soon would run out of fuel. So then you move on to tank 2, where you can go a bit longer because the tank is bigger. And these first two tanks will deplete much of your stored creatine phosphate and your stored carbohydrate to use as a fuel. These get used up, not all the way of course, but a good bit of them do, before moving on to tank 3, which is the largest tank but the slowest tank. This tank uses fat for the largest part of its fuel supply. So in order to make a real dent in tank 3, the fat tank, you must first have to slow down and burn through tank 2 or use a lot of fuel. Then you can rely on tank 3 for the long haul. So you can see that knowing how to use your energy systems to your advantage is a huge asset when wanting to change your body composition. After digesting and absorbing the food you eat, it's just amazing how it is used to provide you with energy for everything you want to do, including changing your body composition. Try this. Aim to change your food intake and carbohydrate intake based on your activity level each day.